This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to You're Dead to Me, a history podcast for people who don't like history, or at least people who forgot to learn any at school. My name is Greg Jenner, I'm a public historian, author, and I'm the chief nerd on the BBC comedy show Horrible Histories. I love me some medieval poetry, but it's better if it's got gratuitous fart gags in it. In every episode, I am joined by an expert historian with a head full of fascinating facts, and an A-grade comedian with a smart mouth and nice hair. And today we're jumping back 500 years, sharpening our sacrificial knife, and preparing to eat roast iguana as we get to grips with the Aztec. Joining me to fill in the blanks in your memory banks are two lovely guests. In History Corner, her Twitter account describes her as a historian and human sacrifice enthusiast. Worrying. Hopefully that's only a professional interest. She's a leading Aztec specialist. In fact, she's the leading Aztec specialist in the UK. She's from the University of Sheffield. It is Dr Caroline Dodds Pennock. Hi, Caroline. How are you?
I'm all right, sir.
You've got laryngitis.
Except for the laryngitis, but I'm going to press on.
Well, thank you for battling on. We appreciate it. And in Comedy Corner, making a triumphant return to the podcast, having smashed it with the Spartans, he's the best-loved Joel in the land, apart from Billy Joel. Sorry, but you can't argue with Billy Joel.
I don't argue with him at all. There's actually one other Joel Dommett in the country. Did you know that, Greg?
Is he better than you?
Well, I messaged him on Facebook because that's what Facebook's for. And I said, hello, your name's Joel Dommett, my name's Joel Dommett. Let's go for a Nando's. And he just messaged back saying, no. So where's the fun in that?
His loss. Well, I think you've given away the game there. In Comedy Corner, it is the wonderful Joel Dommett.
Yes.
So, what do you know?
This is the segment where I summarise some of the things that our listeners might know about the Aztec, and I don't think we know that much, really. So, the Aztec are, in pop culture, you're thinking pyramids, you're thinking gold, you're thinking big, chunky statement jewellery. There's the sacrifices, there's the jungle. You're probably thinking Indiana Jones being chased by a huge boulder after nicking a fertility statue from a booby-trapped tomb, which actually wasn't an Aztec tomb, but never mind. You might be imagining dudes running around with elaborate headdresses. Maybe you're thinking of the Aztec zone on the Crystal Maze. If you're a chocoholic like me, maybe you're thinking of Montezuma's chocolate shop. BBC impartiality clause, other chocolate manufacturers are available. Dr Caroline, first and foremost, why are you an Aztec specialist? Did you just sort of start at the beginning of the course directory and go, hey, Aztecs, that'll do?
No, there weren't that many Aztec courses when I was a student. And I would have been an Anglo-Saxon specialist, surely, if I started at the beginning.
That's me told.
That's why she's here.
Honestly, it was just a childhood interest that never really let go of me. I mean, who doesn't love temples and human sacrifice? And it just seemed so fascinating and exciting from when I was really small, and I just carried on with it.
Joel, have you got any Aztec knowledge?
Kind of a little bit. Basic, obviously. I do genuinely remember in primary school doing quite a lot of Aztec stuff. We did, I think the only two things that I can really remember from primary school is we did Romans and Aztecs. I remember sort of the big sort of pyramid-y things, and then the human sacrifice stuff and stuff like that. And I also went to Mexico with this program, Joel and Nish versus the World. And we went to the Tarahumara tribe, which was like, I genuinely don't know where it was, but we were really deep, far away from where planes land. Basically, they've been sort of messed over as a people throughout history. Everyone who's sort of come over there has tried to sort of change them and given them the maddest diseases, and as a result, they just went further and further into the hills until they were basically so far in the hills that nobody can reach them.
Except for you.
Except for me and a crew of television people.
Hello.
Hey, girls.
Well, I mean, that's fantastic. Let's look at the Aztec. Just, can we have some basics? How long ago are we talking? What is an Aztec? How big is the Aztec Empire?
So the Aztecs are in central Mexico from about 1325. We're talking about the people of the city of Tenochtitlan is what you're usually talking about, and the empire that surrounds it. They're about contemporary with the Tudors. People think of them as a kind of ancient culture, but actually they're quite modern. People don't think of them as being contemporaries, which I find really interesting. And you're talking about a sphere of influence of something like 200, 220 square kilometres, which is about the size of the UK. So quite large, but only 5 or 6 million people. So much more dispersed in terms of the population.
Oh, imagine that, how great that would be.
5 or 6 million people.
How much easier it would be to get to work if there was only 6 million people in the UK.
Yeah, but you wouldn't have any bus drivers, would you?
Sometimes when I'm in like really heavy traffic, the other day, I went to watch the Avengers movie, right? And then I was in really heavy traffic on the way home, and I was like, oh, I think Thanos had a point. We could get rid of half these people. That'd be fantastic. Get home so much quicker.
All right, so we're 5 minutes in and already we're advocating the wiping out of half of all humanity. That's a good start. Great. So the Aztec are essentially, you say they found their sort of empire in 1325, which is, 700 years ago?
Yes.
And
although that's not the founding of the empire, that's the founding of the city. The empire, they only really come to power about 100 years after that. So only about 100 years before the Spanish arrived. They're quite a new empire.
And who did they take over from?
So it's a sort of, what's the word? It's not so much an empire in the way we might understand it, where you sort of take over loads of territory. It's more cities fighting to be supreme and be at the top of a tribute pyramid, be in charge of the region. And so in the early 1400s, the triple alliance of 3 cities, of which Tenochtitlan is one, sort of fight it out for who's going to become dominant. They negotiate and Tenochtitlan comes to prominence. So it's at that point that they become the head of a kind of pyramid that stretches across most of central Mexico.
Tenochtitlan is the capital city, and it's massive. How much bigger is it than London at this time? Because we think of London as time being busy, but actually we're talking about a much bigger city.
We do think of London as being one of the biggest cities, but actually this is maybe 5 times larger. It's almost certainly the largest city any of the conquistadors have ever seen, which is amazing. Reasonable estimates for the population are somewhere between about 150,000 and 700,000. I would come down at about 250,000.
Wow.
In 13 square kilometres. So it's a really bustling kind of place.
So London's like 50,000 people.
Yeah.
Which is now like Tunbridge Wells.
Yeah. Seville is bigger, actually. It's about 60,000
at
that time.
But Tenochtitlan, 250,000 people. And that's the capital city, but there are other people outside that as well, living in the suburbs, commuting in.
It's not just the capital, it is the place where the Aztecs, by which we mean the Tenoch, the people of the city of Tenochtitlan, the people who those are the people we mean when we think about the Aztecs.
Do they call themselves Aztecs?
They don't.
So we call them Aztecs, but
we call them Aztecs, and there is some suggestion in some of the sources that maybe they called themselves something like that because they came from a place called Aztlan. They are the people of Aztlan. That's where the word Aztec comes from.
Sounds so like Azkaban.
It does, doesn't it?
So Harry Potter right now.
And it gets even more like that. It's a kind of a 7 caves and 7 tribes come out of 7 caves in this place of the white herons, in Aztlan. It is really, it's a mythical history, actually.
Yeah.
And you can't disentangle those things in Aztec culture, the myth and the history. And so they come from Aztlan, and that's where the word Aztecs comes from. They would have called themselves either the Tenoch, the people of the city of Tenochtitlan, or Mexica Chichimeca, the people of Mexico.
Which is where we get Mexico from.
Exactly.
Mexica becomes Mexico. So
it's dreadful. It's impossible to Google for Mexica because you just get Mexico for everything.
Well, that's fair enough. How are they building this whacking great city then? If they're a relatively new power, is it slave labour, or are they just, do they all do a sort of busy weekend and go, come on, let's all build a massive city?
They have a labour service, so it's a really communal, collective kind of place. So each district, each calpulli, as they're called, they send a certain number of men for a certain number of days, essentially. So you have all this communal activity. It's a society where people have communal obligations.
Okay. Yeah.
And building aqueducts and roads and temples is one of them. There are also slaves, but they're not mostly used in that way.
So like
they're not
everyone
large scale.
has to do their bit, essentially. It's like... So it's sort of communism in a certain way, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it is basically collective activity. That was the word I was thinking.
Collective activity.
It's kind of collective, and that filters all the way down. So they have communal grain stores. People share the workload at a local level.
Yeah.
They have land that is owned locally, and if you get a piece of land to work, you don't own the land, you own the fruits of the land.
Yeah.
And if you don't work it, then someone comes and warns you that you have to.
Yeah.
And if you don't work it for another year, for another season, then they take it off you and give it to somebody else.
It seems like a very good way of living. Did they write?
They do write, but it's pictographic writing.
Right,
Some
so
of it is phonetic. There's a big row.
So what do you mean by
amongst
pictographics?
historians.
Do you mean like hieroglyphs or
It's somewhere between pictures representing things and hieroglyphs.
Okay.
So it's a pictoglyph system is what it's called. It's where images represent concepts rather than words. So a picture of a temple is a temple.
Yeah.
But then there are some concepts. So a flag means 20, for example.
Wow.
And it's starting to develop phonetic elements, but they're not fully developed.
Yeah.
So when Cortez arrives, because his name sounds like Coatl, which is snake, his name glyph is a snake.
Wow.
Oh, that's very fitting.
So it's
isn't
a kind
it?
of adaptive
cool.
language.
Slithering
It
serpent
is, yeah.
Cortez.
Needs
Except
to be a
serpents were honoured though in Aztec culture
Okay,
because
all right.
they're all about blood and rebirth because of the shedding of the skin.
Okay, all right. And the pyramids, I mean, Joel, when you went to Mexico, did you run up any pyramids and do the Rocky Balboa leap and punch in the air?
Even when we went to Peru, we didn't go to, what's the place that everyone goes to in Peru?
Machu Picchu.
Machu Picchu. We didn't go there. We decided to go up a mountain sort of fairly near, but that was much higher.
Pyramids are pretty much exclusively for religious purposes. The one in Tenochtitlan has two temples at the top, one to Huitzilopochtli and one to Tlaloc. So that's the god of war and the god of water, which are basically the two foundations of the civilization: war, sacrifice, tribute, and agriculture and fertility and so on from rains and things like that.
And you mentioned gods. I mean, Aztecs, do they have lots of gods? Do they have just a few? How many gods in the pantheon, and how do they worship them? What's the religion?
Loads of gods. I couldn't give you a number because
Okay.
there are so many of them, and so many of them have different aspects, and people argue about whether one god has two aspects or whether it's two gods.
Okay.
And so there's just loads. There's
Yeah.
gods for...
Like the Romans, like the Greeks. I mean, it's
exactly.
the idea of functional gods with their own little purview, their own little
Yeah.
ministry.
And some of them have large purviews, like the god of water, and some of them have small purviews, like the god of pulque, which is alcoholic drink.
Hello. Okay, let's hear more about that god. The god of alcoholic drink.
Yeah, so there's a god of pulque. Pulque is a cactus drink. You don't really get it over here because unlike where tequila is distilled and so it keeps really well, pulque is fermented and so you have to drink it fresh. You basically chop the top off the cactus and you can make pulque in it. It's a milky, kind of bitter drink.
Well, we've talked a little about religion. We've talked about pyramids. It's time to talk about what we've all come for: human sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we look at the Aztecs and kind of go, wow, crazy, barbarous, violent, but there's a logic to it. Joel, what do you think the techniques are for human sacrifice in Aztec culture?
What I can remember, it's very probably quite stabby. It feels like it's quite stabby. I remember it's on top using those pyramids, I suppose, and then the blood. Does the blood run into something? I'm imagining the blood running into, like, down the pyramid into something cool, but I may be getting it confused with one of the Blade movies.
It's a very easy mistake to make.
Yeah.
Caroline.
Yeah, I think that's a Blade movie.
Oh, I knew it was Wesley Snipes.
The sacrifice on the top of the temple is right there.
Okay.
But the thing is, there are actually lots of different kinds of sacrifices. But the most common one is to sacrifice someone on top of a pyramid. You would lean the person back over the altar. Now, when we talk about sacrificial altars, you imagine a kind of big flat table, and often that's how they're shown in popular culture. But you're actually talking about a small stone, more like a kind of tall coffee table. And you have 5 priests. 4 of them hold the arms and legs and stretch the person back, so the chest is stretched right in the air. And then the 5th person uses an obsidian knife to cut the heart out
Obsidian
from
is
under
glass,
the rib
isn't it? It's
cage.
volcanic glass.
It is a kind of volcanic glass. It's the sharpest substance in the world, sharper than a scalpel.
Wow.
Wow.
I was reading recently.
So they don't have steel, they don't have iron, but they've got something better, really.
Where it's better for sharp cutting. It's
Okay.
quite bad for example, cutting through armour because it shatters if it comes in contact with steel.
And was the person being sacrificed complicit? Were they happy with being sacrificed, being picked, or was it like a horrible thing to be picked?
Theoretically, they were happy.
Sign here.
In
Yeah.
most cases. So people believed when they were being sacrificed that it was for a greater cause.
Yeah.
It's a bit like martyrdom, actually.
Yeah.
It's quite like martyrdom, and that you're going to a better place.
Yeah.
That said, the sources suggest that some people went happily leading and heralding their cities and sort of glorifying their cities and shouting triumphantly, and other people were dragged kicking and screaming.
Okay.
And that's exactly what you would expect.
Joel, can you guess what Hui Tzotzonpantli means or was?
Brexit means Brexit?
I mean, my pronunciation is probably quite poor, but
Brexit means
I'm trying to do it phonetically. The Huid Tasson Pantley is an enormous skull rack. And Caroline can tell us a bit more. But in my head, I'm imagining like a spice rack in your mum's cupboard full of herbs and spices. But this is a massive rack of skulls that have the skin removed. Maybe are they just the skulls?
Just they were just the skulls now, though probably originally they would have just put the heads on.
Okay, so there would have been flesh, there would have been eyes, and then they would have been eaten by the birds.
And you're talking they're impaled by the spikes. It's that kind of rack.
So it's a huge rack of skulls.
Wow.
You into that?
I mean, it sounds like sort of the backdrop of like an Iron Maiden set.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's kind of it's very heavy metal. It sounds great. This weekend I'm going to see Slipknot live. I'm kind of expecting.
I'm a huge Slipknot fan. Yeah.
Who knew that maybe Slipknot were slightly obsessed with the Aztecs? I love that idea.
According to one Spanish conquistador, he estimated 130,000 skulls. That seems too many.
In fact, he didn't estimate. He claimed he'd counted them, which was really funny because obviously he didn't.
I mean, that would
have taken you a while.
Hilarious.
Wouldn't
That's
it?
such a great person. Like, that's one of those people who's just like, yeah, you know, one of the classic liar in your friends.
Yeah,
you've always got one friend at school who's always just like, yeah, totally. I actually scored from the halfway line last night. It was me. I hit the crossbar. Yeah, it was amazing. No one was there to see it, but counted it. 130,000 skulls. Counted every one of them. No one else was there.
And what are the skulls for?
It's part of the sacrificial ritual.
Okay.
We're not sure exactly what they're for, but presumably it's at least partly to show how impressive and terrifying the Aztec gods are.
Yeah.
To intimidate people who come to the city, to show how they're honouring the gods. Look at all these sacrifices we have given them. People did think it was a massive exaggeration, but actually only last year it was last year the news came out about it. They've been excavating since about 2014 a massive tower of skulls that they found in Mexico City. And it is actually it's different to what we'd imagine, not these crossbars that the Spanish had depicted, but a huge, like a cement tower with all the skulls embedded in it.
Wow.
It is like something out of a movie, isn't it? It's really chilling.
Yeah.
But almost impressive. I mean,
it's very impressive in kind of the literal sense that people would be very struck by it.
Sure, yeah.
But it is also pretty terrifying, and I think that is part of the point.
Is there a little bit of cannibalism?
There is some cannibalism, but it's on quite a small scale.
Okay.
There have been some really funny... I shouldn't say that academic work is funny, but there was some work that said that they were committing sacrifice for cannibalism, and there just isn't enough of it for that to make sense.
Yeah.
But it does mean I've got some wonderful tables of statistics about how much flesh you can get off people's bodies that I give to students.
Bloody hell.
They love that. It's really interesting to think about that. But in reality, cannibalism happens only on a very small scale, and it's part of a really interesting, quite intimate ceremony where the captive lives in the district of his captor after he's been captured in war. They're responsible for looking after him and feeding him, and there's a ceremony they go through where the captor says, "You are as my son," and the captive says, "You are as my father." And then the captor takes his captive to the temple on the day he's going to be sacrificed, and after he's sacrificed he takes the body home. And the best bit, which is the thigh, the tenderest bit, is sent to the Tlatoani, the ruler, for him to eat. And then the friends and family of the captor consume the rest of the body in ceremonial cannibalism. The fascinating thing is that the captor doesn't participate. He stands apart and he's covered in white and he honours the sacrificial victim. And also it's kind of a reminder to his family that he might die as a sacrifice in someone else's city.
Oh, okay.
So it's a really fascinating example of we think of sacrifice being this big thing that happens on temples, but actually people are experiencing it in their homes as well.
Wow.
Let's move away from slightly gross cannibalism, move on to food you might have heard of and would like to eat. Joel, I'm going to fire some foods at you, and you have to guess which one of these does not come from the Aztecs. So,
okay.
Odd one out. So, here is your list. Tomatoes, corn, potatoes, avocado, quinoa, chocolate, chili peppers, and turkey. Which one did not come from the Aztecs?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like quinoa.
Oh, he's done it.
Very good.
Have I really?
Ding, ding, ding. I
Oh.
mean, that is good. We get that from the Inca. That's the Peruvian Inca. So that's slightly further south.
Yeah,
Everything
yeah,
else comes from Aztec food. I mean,
Really?
that's introduced into Europe by the conquest of the Spanish. But, it's interesting, isn't it? Avocado is an Aztec word, is it? A Nahuatl word?
It's derived from Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Chocolatl is also from Nahuatl. So we actually get quite a lot of words and tons of our food from the Aztec word. I mean, try and imagine Italian cooking without tomatoes or peppers.
Or potatoes even,
or potatoes. Not just things like chocolate, but squash, all beans except soybeans come from the Americas.
And they also eat lizard. They eat chihuahua, newt. Anything else that's not on that list?
Pond scum, basically.
Pond scum,
so
right.
they live on an island. They live on an island in a lake.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff, small scale stuff that they get from the water. So the pond scum, the water weeds.
So they sort of fish that out
fish.
and drink that, chew it. What's the?
You can cook it. You can just eat it. It's,
Wow.
And maize. Maize is the really big one.
So corn and maize are...
That's a huge... Maize is what we think of as sweet corn, but it's used like we use wheat.
Yeah.
So they make tortillas out of it. They make a paste that they can just eat while they're on the go or working. You keep it in a pouch and you eat your paste.
Fascinating. That drink was made from corn. It's
all
like...
cornstarch now, of course, is used in loads of products as well these days, isn't it? And we get that from the Aztecs. So, but that came about through,
from the Americas.
Through violent conquest, isn't it? So it's what colonialism does for us, obviously, is that we get to have nice food and they all died. Hooray. Let's look at the lives of ordinary people. A newborn Aztec baby arrives in the world. What is their childhood going to be like? And does it differ if they're a girl or a boy?
So we think of the Aztecs as being quite brutal. We think of all these grand rituals, but actually they're very loving towards their children. When a small baby is born, the whole family gather round and touch it and kind of welcome it into the family. And it's really... Small children, it's quite clear, are tolerated in Aztec culture. They're given a bit of license that most people don't have. But once they're weaned, so once they start eating maize, they are then under obligations to the god of maize and to their communities, and they start having to contribute. You hear accounts of small children going to the market and having to pick up grains and things like that. Life is very different for boys and girls. Once children are weaned, boys go with fathers and girls go with mothers. So women don't do all the childcare. Even if you get divorced, the boy children go with the dad and the girl children go with the mum. It's really interesting.
And they had divorce.
They did have divorce.
Fascinating.
They tried to discourage it, but you could get divorced. And we know it was a real possibility because people draw up marriage contracts to say what would happen to the staff if they got married.
It's so
like a prenup,
isn't it? It's just kind of like that different things happened in different parts of the world without knowing that was happening in other places. It's like they had
probably
divorce.
didn't call it divorce
Well,
at the time, but of course the
been...
Spanish call it divorce. And they're much more tolerant of it than the Spanish at the time were, or the British would have been.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because I think it's because you don't want a community that's at each other's throats all the time. If people are going to do things together and be well organised and, have communal activities, you have to accept that relationships might end.
Yeah.
And so they organise for that. And they also go about making sure everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. So coming back to childhood, boys and girls are educated. They have universal education. It's the only pre-modern culture I know that has universal education. So where boys get kind of more education in warriorhood, things like that, both girls and boys go to a thing called the Cuicacali, the House of Song, where in the evenings they learn songs and stories about their mythical past and their history and so on, and rhetoric and philosophy and religion, all those things.
Wow. So if they've got divorced, they must also have marriage. And
Yes.
obviously marriage is a hugely important part of it. And I'm happily married, you're happily married. Joel, you're soon to be happily married.
Soon to be.
Do you want to hear about Aztec wedding customs? Because last time we
yes.
talked about Spartan customs and they got quite weird quite quick.
Yes.
So I'm hoping less weird. Caroline, can we hear
see.
what a wedding ceremony would be like?
The woman would be dressed in a large cape and she'd be carried on the back of an older woman, probably one of the matchmakers who made the pairing, carried to the house of the husband-to-be. And then there's a fascinating reciprocal ceremony where it's about setting them up as a partnership, really. The mother of the bride dresses the son-in-law-to-be in a cape, and she feeds him mouthfuls of food, and the mother of the groom does the same thing for the bride.
Okay.
And then they tie their clothes together into a knot. They literally tie the knot.
That's nice.
And there's lots of other things. So the bride is very adorned and so on. And then, which I think is amazing,
Does she wear feathers? Is that...
She does. She gets feathers
So
and sort of
bird feathers.
glittery face paint.
Lovely.
Like iron pyrites, so it's really sparkly.
Okay.
And it's a moment where the community all kind of come together, and that's the moment where you become liable for paying into the communal grain store, for doing communal labour service. And also, if you're poor, you get given capes from the communal store, from your community, to set up your household. So it's like they see this marriage as the beginning of being an adult, but also the beginning of your contribution to the community.
Any of that sound applicable to the Dommett wedding?
It's actually a massive coincidence because it sounds just like what we've planned. We're doing it. I can't wait. I can't wait for my...
You're doing feathers. You're doing...
For my mum to feed me whilst I'm going down the aisle.
While your partner is carried by an old woman.
Yeah, it's all on the list, actually. I think maybe we might have had a Aztecian wedding planner. I think we might have...
They're very affordable here.
Yeah. We're having a human for our meal.
Oh, God.
Can't wait. So apparently the thigh is the best bit.
So we've talked about marriage. We talked about women and men coming together. We, I guess, need to talk about warriors. We've mentioned warriors already going off. Joel, you do a bit of combat stuff. I know you enjoy martial arts, and in this show, Joel Nish versus the World, you often fight people, usually children.
Usually children. That's the worst part of it. I mean, it's basically I'm not very good at fighting. I'm not a very combative person.
You're a very nice man.
Yeah, I just don't like the fight and stuff. So they can't obviously put me against someone who's good at fighting. So they tend to just put me against the children,
who still defeat you.
Yeah, I think that the show should be genuinely called Joel Goes Around the World and Fights Children. It's not quite as catchy.
Sounds slightly problematic. I'm not sure Twitter would like that.
Yeah, I think actually it'd probably do better than Joel Nish versus the World, ironically.
But I mean, what is warrior training like, or what is warrior combat like for an Aztec warrior? What kind of weapons are they using? Obsidian? I mean, we've heard they don't use steel. What kind of weapons are they wearing? What kind of armour?
They wear cotton armour, so sort of padding, and they would have shields as well, often wooden shields. And then, the weapons are made from obsidian. So you would very often have something called a maquahuitl, which is like a big club with bits of obsidian stuck into it.
Like a mace, almost?
Hit people with a bit like somewhere between a mace and a sword.
Okay.
So it's a longer blade, more pieces
and it
stuck
is sharp,
into it.
but
yes.
You sort of hit people over the head with it.
Yes, but actually you don't hit people over the head, because as a warrior, what you're trying to do is to take captives for sacrifice. So most of Aztec warfare is about cutting people in the legs to try and make them fall over so you can drag them off the battlefield. It's not very lethal.
That's interesting.
That's quite interesting, isn't it?
So there's a whole other technique of warfare, which is you're trying to maim rather than kill.
It puts them at a massive disadvantage against the Spanish.
Yeah, the Spanish,
of course it does.
Who
The
are
Spanish
trying
are
to
like,
kill them.
I'm going to kill you. And they're like, would you just mind lying down over there?
Yeah,
so
it's probably much
away.
more of an issue than stuff like the guns. People overemphasise the significance of guns. But actually the Spanish didn't have that many guns when they encountered the Aztecs, maybe 20 or 30
and,
in total.
There's a thing called the Flower War. Joel, do you know what this is?
The Flower War?
Yeah, have a guess.
Oh, it sounds wonderful, though. It sounds like my mum's a garden designer, so it sounds like something my mum would sort of do at the local garden centre.
Sort of horticultural battle.
Maybe you get there and you don't get there early enough and someone else wants the flowers that you want. A flower war happens at Wyvale.
Caroline, is it as lovely as that?
Sadly not. The flowers are a metaphor for the spirits of warriors, and so it's a war designed solely for the purpose of taking captives for sacrifice. Some people have argued about whether it actually existed. I think on balance of probability, probably did.
Okay.
But yeah, it's almost like a team sport. You kind of agree that you'll come out to a battle at the same time with another city because you both want captives to take. And that might be why they left the Tlaxcalans and a few other groups, the Tepanecs most notably, not under Aztec influence, because you don't want to have to trek 30 days to get to the nearest enemy. If you want some sacrificial victims, you want somebody nearby that you can just have a quick flower walk.
Kind of sounds like what happens in school, where with the rival school. Everyone has a rival school and they're like, oh my God, lunchtime Tuesday, we're going to meet up in the playing fields and we're going to have a massive fight. And it never happened. Everyone always talked about it happening. And our local school was called Marlwood, sort of the enemies. And we were like, oh, we're going to meet up with them. We're going to fight them. Everyone's going to fight them on Monday playing fields. And it never happened, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, I mean, you don't sound like you were a warrior, really.
I had a mace with some glass in the end, and I was ready.
You were ready.
I was ready to take out their legs.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you do like fighting children.
Yeah, exactly. Everything I've learned.
Maybe you could go back there, and now you're a grown man. We've talked already about you running 34 miles, which is a long, long, long way. The Aztec Empire is quite large, and messages have to be sent. And they're sent by runners, aren't they? There's a sort of relay system. Joel, would you fancy being in a little relay system? It wasn't as long as... How many miles are we talking?
Between 2 and 5 miles.
That's doable, isn't it?
Not a bad amount.
So you jog out of Tenochtitlan with your little message, and you'd go 5 miles, and you'd pass it to your mate, and he'd pass it, and they'd pass it, and they'd pass it, and eventually it's gone 100 miles.
Yeah.
Is that how it happens? So each one does like their own little leg, and it's like a sort of relay, and it goes eventually to that same person.
So what do you know, at the beginning of the show, we talked about gold. They don't have steel, they don't have iron, but they do have gold, don't they? They've got lovely shiny gold. Do they use it as currency, or is it just for making shiny things?
They don't have currency in the way we'd understand. It's a barter system.
Okay.
Gold is one of the common media of exchange in gold quills, but no, it's not. It's not a currency, and actually, it's not even valued as much as things like beautiful feathers and so on. They do use it for masks and artwork and jewellery,
right?
But feathers were more valued.
Wow. That's so interesting.
It's used in medicine because one of the names for gold is tonatu Iquiitl, which means basically sun excrement of the sun. Sun shit, yeah.
Wow.
And that leads you into all of these avenues about how you might use it that relate to the sun. So one use is for medicine, and the dust or shavings of gold were eaten by people who had hemorrhoids or skin pustules. And that's because Nanahuatzin, who was the god who became the sun, it's a great tale of sort of the poor boy who's done good. There are these 2 gods, one is glorious and wonderful, and one is poor and covered with pustules, and he is the one who is the bravest, jumps into the fire and becomes the sun. So the idea is it's a sympathetic magic. You know, he had all these pustules and he became the sun, so if I eat the gold, which is the sun shit, then I will be cured of my hemorrhoids and pustules.
Wow.
And so was that partly why the Spanish were kind of interested in them, because they had loads of gold but didn't know the value of it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Gold is absolutely a big focus for the Spanish.
Yeah.
You know, there are all these jokes in indigenous American texts about how they would eat the gold if they could. You know, that it must be, it's so essential to them and they must want to eat it. They're really skeptical, indigenous people, about this value. Why
do Europeans value gold? Is it because it's rarer to them? And so why is it still valued today? Is it because it's still rare, or is it...
Yeah, it's still very rare, and it's chemically sort of not very reactive. It's quite soft. It's easily used you can easily shape it. It's hugely rare, very, very valuable. The Egyptians had lots of gold, but the Aztec obviously had huge amounts of it, and silver too.
They had a reasonably large amount of it. It's
some
not
silver and
vast quantities, but no. So they had quite a lot of gold, far more silver. Not just in the Aztec region, but in the regions outside. It's really in Bolivia, places like that, where the silver is. But we think of the Spanish having this sort of river of gold coming from the Americas, but actually the amount of silver massively outweighs the amount of gold.
Really?
It causes them huge inflation.
Yeah, it crushes the Spanish economy because they have so much silver turned up that suddenly everything devalues, because there's too much money. So it's really funny. The Spanish Empire goes from being the sort of wealthiest in Europe to suddenly sort of having financial crisis after financial crisis.
It's also because they're really terrible at managing their money and their trade policy, and they borrow huge amounts from people in places like Genoa and Italy. And so people are already... Even before Cortes gets to the Aztecs, so when they're just in the Caribbean, people are saying every bit of gold that comes into Spain is going straight out again into the pockets of bankers. You know, we've got no money. And this is before the gold even starts coming, really. They're just in massive debt.
Wow.
Let's talk about the most famous emperor, because actually we're recording this in 2019, and 500 years ago, almost to the month really, Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, arrives in Mexico and meets this glorious, powerful emperor called Moctezuma.
Moctezuma is what we tend to call him for
Okay.
ease. His actual name was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin.
That is a lot harder to say.
Yes. I
So
understand.
we go with Moctezuma because it's close enough to the original, but still usable.
Okay. And sometimes he's known as Montezuma. That's the
Yes.
traditional is Montezuma, and now we say Moctezuma.
Yes, Montezuma is the traditional one, but that's like an anglicised version of a modernised version.
Okay.
So we tend not to use it.
So,
Now, if we can avoid what I try and make people not use it.
Yeah.
And he is like the big daddy. He rules this empire. He's super powerful. He has got 2 wives, 150 concubines. Is that right? A load of kids.
Well, he's certainly got 150 wives or concubines. It's
Okay.
not quite clear whether they're wives. I think he can only have one principal wife.
Oh, okay.
So the person who he does the real ceremonies of marriage with, the person you
Okay.
commit to, but then he has lots of other wives or concubines or mistresses because the
so much
Spanish
work.
Yeah.
Well, although there is a question about whether they then support each other and look after each other's kids, but only the children of principal wives are properly significant, if that
Okay.
makes sense. But because Aztec culture isn't dynastic in the way European culture is, you don't just inherit power. Being in the position of being in the palace already makes you in a position to kind of do well in life.
The Aztec are destroyed by the Spanish. You say Cortez turns up and initially tries to sort of negotiate, and then it turns into a horrible war. How does such a mighty empire result in so many millions of deaths?
2 things I would say. One is that it's not just this handful of conquistadors against the Spanish. There actually are lots of allies of the Spanish quite early on. So the Tlaxcalans, who we mentioned a couple of times, first they fight against the Spanish, then they ally with them. So by the time Cortez gets to Tenochtitlan, he has tens of thousands at least
Okay.
of indigenous allies. So it's kind of it's infighting.
Right.
A lot of this is infighting.
So it's a civil war almost.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
Tlaxcalans, they slaughter lots of the Tenoch when they get to the city because they've been at war with them for decades, centuries maybe. The other thing is disease. The indigenous Americans have no immunity to European diseases, and so wave after wave of European disease, not just smallpox but flu, measles, mumps, all kinds of things come and just wipe out civilizations because if there's no one to care for the people who are sick, so more of them die, and it's just devastating.
It's the worst thing about colonization, I think, is the disease part of it. Kind of weirdly, war makes it a little bit more acceptable. You kind of feel like people are going there, even though it's not. It's horrible colonization. It's people going over somewhere and colonizing via war is horrible. But just by the fact that they're winning because they're disgusting and dirty and disease ridden just feels like so annoying. Like these wonderful people who live and just like love feathers. Like, and yes, they sacrificed a few people, but like 130,000 maybe. But the fact that they got wiped out by smallpox is just like, ugh, feels so frustrating.
And it's so horrifying. Tenochtitlan, of course, is a heavily densely populated area, so it suffers from disease more than other places.
Yeah.
And you're talking about maybe 90% in the first 10 years.
Wow.
I mean, imagine 9 out of every 10 people you know
10 years.
dying in the next 10 years.
Okay, so that's more than Thanos.
It's just
That's more than
unimaginable.
Thanos, yeah.
I mean,
It's
that's
just
Thanos
unimaginable.
That is it.
Sorry, that's not very comedy, is it?
Plus. No, but history is horrible sometimes.
But it is
Yeah,
just horrifying.
Absolutely.
The nuance window!
This is the part of the show where our historian gets to say something that's really important and powerful, and we listen for 2 minutes without interruption, and then we go, So, are you ready, Caroline?
Yeah, gosh, that was a bit of a build-up, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but, this is your big moment. So, 2 minutes on the clock, starting now, go.
So what I want to say is that it's possible everything we've just talked about is wrong, because the sources for Aztec culture are so bad, so weak, and so flawed that almost everything I've said, I have caveated some things, but I could have caveated almost anything except probably what they ate. So you have this problem that the Spanish arrive and they destroy all of those wonderful pictographic documents we've been talking about. There were perhaps 13 documents for all of central Mexico still remaining from before the conquest. None of them are from Tenochtitlan. And so what we have, where we're getting our picture of Aztec culture from, is Spaniards talking to surviving indigenous people, or just making stuff up, or misunderstanding, or making observations that might be wrong. And then added on top of that is the fact that in the 1430s, when the Aztecs come to power in the Triple Alliance, Ahuitzotl, the ruler, destroys all the documents and rewrites the history then. He creates this grand mythical history for the Aztecs, promoting the way that they are. So, of course, they're in charge, and it was always destined that they would be in charge. And so he rewrites the past. So what we have is a past that has already been rewritten once, being told to people who really don't understand the language or know what's happening. And they then write that down in a patchy kind of way. And also nearly all of the informants are elite men. So what we're getting is an elite male perspective. The Aztecs, as we know, were obsessed with blood, but we don't know anything about menstruation, for example, because it wouldn't occur to friars to talk to men, to talk to the Aztec men they were talking to about menstruation. So the whole thing might just be me interpreting things wrong that were interpreted wrong by Spaniards that were made up by Aztecs.
Wow.
There you go. Ignore everything.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
I mean, that's the problem with history.
That is the problem with history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, historians complain about sources all the time, but the Aztec ones really are spectacularly bad.
Especially ketchup. Am I right, guys? Sauces, ketchup.
Very nice.
Cool. That's why I'm here.
Bring the big jokes.
So what do you know now?
Joel, you have you've now got a little bit of a quiz coming up.
Oh yeah, give me a quiz.
Because you've been here, you've heard some stuff. We've had an expert for you, so
Yes.
let's see what you've learned.
Oh, okay, go.
I'm gonna get my stopwatch up again, and I'm gonna give you 60 seconds to answer 10 questions.
Okay.
And they're hopefully relatively answerable. So give it a crack. 60 seconds on the clock. Here we go. Name 3 foods we get from the Aztecs.
Maize, tomatoes, and rice.
No.
Oh, maize, tomatoes, and not quinoa.
That'll do.
Not quinoa. Yeah, there we go.
Chocolate will do.
Chocolate, chilies.
An Aztec wedding involved the bride being carried by whom?
The bride was carried by the father of the bride.
Mother of the bride. The older lady, yeah.
Yeah.
No, matchmaker.
Matchmaker, okay.
Matchmaker and being fed at the same time with a cake. That's all I remember.
What did most people drink at a wedding? We haven't talked about this, but have a guess.
Oh, blood probably?
No, chocolate.
Chocolate.
Not as gory as
Emperor Moctezuma had roughly how many concubines or wives?
150?
Yes. According to the Spanish source, how many skulls were in the Great Skull Rack?
130,000?
Yes, too many skulls. What was the purpose of a flower war?
A flower war was it actually meant gods, and it was gods having a war of gods or something.
No, it was to capture enemies and to sacrifice them.
Sacrifice them, something like that. Yeah, I was close enough.
For roughly how many years did the Aztecs have an empire?
Oh,
Near a century.
I don't know. I don't know. How long? About 500 years?
200 years, roughly,
Oh.
from 1325 to
Not that
1520.
long, really, is
Not
it?
really. An Aztec war club was made of what natural volcanic glass?
Oh, what's it called? Something to begin with A.
Begins with O.
Shield. What is
Obsidian.
Obsidian? I knew it sounded
What was
cool.
the name of the Spanish conquistador who ended the Aztec Empire? Cortez. And the population of Tenochtitlan was 5 times greater than London. How many people was that roughly?
Oh, was it like 250,000?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, very
Yes.
good. I think that's 7 out of 10, which is
not bad.
very respectable.
Not bad.
They
I
are
think
tough
that's-
questions,
I could
particularly
almost
since-
pass the GCSE with that, I think.
No, but
That's basically Key Stage 3, what I just learned.
sure, yeah, it's primary school stuff, but it's all good. Thank you so much, Joel. Thank you so much, Caroline. I hope you've both enjoyed coming in and chatting about the Aztecs. Caroline, if people want to know more about the Aztecs, what's the name of your book?
Bonds of blood, gender, life cycle, and sacrifice in Aztec culture.
It's all about sacrifice and all that sort of stuff. It's very interesting. And Joel, are we going to see photos of your bride with feathers and shiny
Yes.
face paint?
Yeah, she's going to have a cape and her dad is going to feed her. or something, whatever happened.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is the end of the podcast. And so I have to now say thank you. Thanks to my fantastic guests, Joel Dommett and Dr Caroline Dodds Pennock, from the University of Sheffield. Join us next time for another thing that does history. That's how it works, really. Make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, click the like button, all the stuff that you know how to do. I'm now just off to go and listen to NSYNC singing Tearing Out My Heart, which will have a slightly different meaning suddenly. Anyway, until next time, thank you and goodbye. You're Dead to Me was a Muddy Knees media production for BBC Radio 4. The researchers were Emma Nagouse and Josh Daniels, and the producer was Dan Morelle.
Hello, it's Sophie Duker.
Heidi Regan.
Ned Sedgwick here.
We've been given 30 seconds to tell you why Grown Up Land is the podcast that will change your life for the better.
Why you'll be healthier, happier, more culturally enriched and totally confident about everything in every way.
But there is a small snag, as none of that is true at all. What you will become is confident that everyone else is just as confused, frustrated and anxious as you are. Every week we're joined by a brilliant guest to talk about things like sex, fear, rejection, jealousy, sex, and we often end up sharing way too much about our personal lives.
Yeah, I should really rein that in.
That's Grown Up Land, the podcast about the exhausting pursuit of adulthood.
Make sure you subscribe on BBC Sounds.